Good morning to all of you. At the outset, I express my heartfelt gratitude to Helsinki Citizens Assembly to invite me here and share about our work. I am just going to share with you about the findings of a 2-year-long study which was done during 2008 and 2009. It was a productive collaboration between academia and the NGO, as we were discussing yesterday. It was a very productive collaboration in that sense. And this study was supported by Sasakawa Peace Foundation of Japan. And it was done in India, one on a sub-regional level and another further micro level on a provincial level. And the findings of the book has been published in a book form. It has been published by World Scientific Singapore in 2010. Photocopied like some of the important chapters which are on the display, you can collect it. And the foreword for this book has been written by two eminent persons, Madam Sadako Ogata, who was the co-chair of Independent Commission on Human Security in 2001, and Dr. Surin Pitswan, who was the Secretary General, ASEAN. I will just very quickly go through the context, since a lot of things has been discussed since yesterday. I'll very quickly go through like some of the background or the context of this study. The human security concept is still evolving, but it needs to be further expanded, explored, debated, and disseminated as widely as possible, which I think we have been doing through many such forums. The perception, as you know, varies across the country, across the region. Just immediately after the 26/11 USA, when you ask people about their perception of threat, the common question was, the answer was basically terrorism. In South Africa, the availability of basic needs. Central Asia, a loss of national identity and withdrawal of the state facilities. A lot of regional approaches on human security have been made, basically initiated by the UNESCO, the Arab states in 2005, Latin America and Caribbean in 2005, East Asia 2004, Central Asia 2006. So a lot of regional studies on human security have since been done and spearheaded by UNESCO. But at the same time, I think it will be interesting to examine how threats are connected at local, national, regional, and global levels. I think the real challenge is by designating the individual rather than the state as the referent object of security, human security is slowly emerging as a framework that can serve as a means to evaluate threats, foresee crises, analyze the causes of discord, and propose solutions entailing a redistribution of responsibilities. So this study has 3 distinctive features. Basically developing a human security and human security governance index that measures both challenges to human security and responses to human security. Second, of course it's not there, basically to develop some sort of mapping tool for the conflict zone. And the third feature is suggesting a human security impact assessment tool. So these are the 3 distinctive features of this research. Where did we do this study? We selected 2 sub-regions in India. One is the Northeast India, where you can see all these places. Basically, this area. Why did you select? Basically, it's a very conglomerate of 7 states, predominantly tribal states. It has a conflict history of over 40 years of armed rebellion. The most heterogeneous region in India, having 250 social groups and more than 75 languages in those regions. Only 2% of its land mass is connected with India, where you can just see here. And the rest of its boundaries, around 4,500 kilometers, is shared with South and South Asian countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, China, and Myanmar. Basically, the whole region, barring a few states, is exposed to an atmosphere of terror, where a situation of anxiety, helplessness, and a fear of being killed, raped, or displaced prevail all around. So that was the reason why we chose to focus on Northeast as a location of this study. And second, like we go back to Odisha on the eastern tip, where like I hail from. It's a state, it's a province. India has got around 30 states, and Odisha is one of them. We selected Odisha because it's the most poorest state of India, with 46% of its population living below poverty line. And at the same time, it's a classic case of failure of the trickle-down approach. I mean, it's a very irony. It's a classic case of like both the sides. On the one side, it's a state where 1/3 of country's coal, iron, and bauxite resources are located. It has got a huge coastline of around 480 kilometers. It has got a huge forest cover. It has got beautiful ports. Despite this, poverty still remains. So whatever development has taken place, it has only benefited the top 10%, top 10% of the population. So that made Odisha as an interesting case for this study from both the angles. And another thing also in this state, out of the 30 districts of the state, 15 districts are affected by Maoist violence. So that is also another reason why we chose this location as this state as a location of this study. So why Human Security Index? It can reveal patterns that would not be otherwise observed. It studies the relationship between multiple insecurities to reveal chains of causality and cumulative impacts which are not currently recognized, articulated, or quantified. The index will provide objective evidence of trends to influence public, media perception, and policy making. So now, like I'm going to share with you the various indicators and other things, since even though like it was done in the case of one of the like South Asian countries, and within that country one sub-region, and further like micro one province. But at the same time, it suggests a framework which you can adopt and customize to your own situation here. So how do we go about our work while developing this Human Security Index? The first job was basically to develop a set of human security indicators. So here, appropriate care was basically taken to include the 3 elements of security: freedom from fear, freedom from want, and life of dignity. And this development of these human indicators was done in a very participatory manner. We had a series of consultations where we invited the academia, the people from the NGOs, and we also invited a couple of like external experts to provide their strategic inputs. We had invited Dr. Amitabh Acharya from Washington, D.C., who writes extensively on human security. And we also invited Dr. Sarabanu Tatsbaks, who is based in Paris and who was involved in writing a couple of like human development report for some countries. So we invited these 2 experts to further fine-tune the research design and to give their strategic inputs while finalizing the indicators. While developing the indicators, basically we looked at three things. One, the severity of the issue. Second, the frequency of the issue or the whatever like we discussed. And the third thing was basically limitation, which was availability of qualitative secondary data from reliable sources and availability of those data over a time period. So on these three parameters, we selected like human security indicators. The first, like we developed some sort of a list of like more than 20, and after a series of deliberations, then we came down to 8, 9, and in case of Northeast, it's around 14. Then the second step was basically a massive data mining exercise, collecting data of all these indicators over a 10-year time period. We took from 97 to 2007. So on all these indicators, the data were collected over a period of like 10 years. Then basically, on the basis of the frequency of and the severity of each of the indicator, we try to develop some sort of like composite index by using a statistical method. It's called principal component analysis. I think I'll just skip that for a moment. Well, these are the indicators. First, let's look at the indicators developed for the state, Odisha. We developed like 7 indicators. The first one was basically the percentage of people living below poverty line. As I mentioned, 47% of its population live below poverty line. Then the number of people affected by malaria. As you know, malaria is endemic in over 100 countries of the world. And among 48% of world's population. In case of Odisha, even if the population-wise, it contributes 3.47% of the entire population, it accounts for 27% of death due to malaria in the country. So that's why we selected this as an indicator. The number of deaths due to natural calamities. You know, Odisha can be called the disaster capital of India. In the last 105 years, it has been affected by disaster 95 times. Floods have occurred for 50 years, droughts have occurred for 32 years, and cyclones have occurred for 11 years. So that's why the high frequency and the severity. So this also we took as an indicator. And of course the loss of like human lives and the loss of like wealth, assets, everything that goes with that. The number of deaths due to dowry. In fact, dowry is a social practice which was prevalent like in India, where right now of course it has been banned, but despite that, it carries on. Where the bride's family pays a hefty price to the bridegroom's family. So in that case, the brides, if they are not able to pay enough money, enough ornaments, they get tortured. In some cases, they are killed by the in-laws. This has been officially banned in India. Still then, it is all pervasive, like it goes in a very clandestine manner in most of the rural pockets. And the fifth one was incidences of communal violence. In fact, in 2008, in terms of number of communal violence, Odisha stood first in the entire country. That's why like we took that as another indicator. Then the habitations not having access to safe drinking water. In rural areas, people still don't have access to potable drinking water facilities. While in case of India as a country, 87% of its population, they have got access to potable drinking water. But in case of Odisha, it's only 64%. Similarly, like for Northeast India, on the right and the red you can see, it was a case of 7 states. So here the indicator was developed for a group of like 7 states. Again, through the same process, series of consultation involving a lot of like stakeholders, then debating, then zeroing down to number of indicators, like poverty, the unemployment among the rural youth, school dropout, infant mortality, death due to tuberculosis, crimes against children, crimes against women, corruption, encroached forest area, right approach and policies, the gap between the budgeted and the actual spending in social sectors, then the pendency of civil and criminal cases, occurrence of violent incidences, then high concentration of police personnel and security personnel. So these are the 14 indicators which were developed for the sub-region, that is called the Northeast India or the Northeast region, where 7 states were there. In case of Odisha also, we try to develop a human security governance indicators. There is budgetary allocation and expenditure on social sector, elementary education and health. We track that over a period of time, how the investment is coming down systematically. The presence of police and the security personnel in the state, how it is inadequate. Then the level of corruption in the government offices. So on these 3 indicators also, we collected like the data and the statistics over a period of like 10 years. So these are then we divided these 10 years into 3 time zones, 98, 2002, and 2007. Well, like right now, after developing this indicator, when we assign this composite index, on the basis of that, we try to do a ranking of the state over a 3 time zone. The first one was, figure 1 is 98. So the less marks scored, it's the most secure districts. So accordingly, like different like colors have been given. And similarly, it has been done for 2002 and 2007. But if you look at the numbers, the idea is to capture how like some of the trends also are changing from year to year. Because in those years, couple of districts are faring much better like in some of the parameters. For example, like you take like 98. In fact, some of the coastal districts which are very economically developed, they are found among the most insecure districts because they have fared very poorly on a couple of indicators, like crime against women, loss of forest cover. So that brings them down, the total scoring. So the idea is to look at a holistic manner, taking into all these 7 indicators and then assigning an index. It's just not like economic development, it cuts across like other areas as well. So that's why you can see the numbers also are somewhere like it is becoming big, becoming further big, like yellow. So like this, when like some of the districts, suppose they are, they fare well in terms of like coverage of more forest. So then they fare better like in the second 5 years or things like that. In some places, some of the districts, they have fared better in terms of arresting the crimes against women. So then they get like more marks or more index, more weightage. So accordingly, and this throws open a lot of like issues, action points. And similarly, the Northeast also has been mapped in terms of like assigning the index weightage, and all the 7 states of the Northeastern region, they have been mapped how secure or how insecure they are over a period of 10 years in 3 time zones. Well, the difference between the Human Development Index and the Human Insecurity Index. The SDI measures the well-being of an area by taking only socio-economic indicators, but not different kinds of non-conventional threats. The SDI may mask much of the variability in human security that can be identified by the HII. The Human Insecurity Index has a much stronger theoretical base for both human security and development than SDI. The Human Insecurity Index tries to convert the issue of perception to objectivity by using some qualitative and quantitative data. The Human Insecurity Index demonstrates that there is a considerable potential for such an index when used in the context of measuring sustainability, development, and human security. So, like this is about the developing the human security indicators and the human security index. But at the same time, this research also talks about developing some sort of mapping tool for the conflict zone. Basically a bottom-up perspective which combines both qualitative and quantitative research, understanding people's perception about multidimensional conflict. So basically the subjective experience of fear and insecurity urgently require substantive investigation. In fact, we did that in Northeast as well as in Odisha, where we basically tried to map the perception of the common people about the threat and the insecurity. Like in case of Odisha, the southern part of Odisha, which is the most affected by Maoist violence, there we just went and talked to around 300 people from this location, all common people, an agricultural laborer, a school teacher, a small shop owner, like that, about to know their perception about the common, their perception about the threat. In fact, you will be surprised to know the findings came, the threat due to the Maoist violence and other things that came quite below. Unemployment, lack of access to basic facilities, corruption in government offices, these were the three which came on the top. They said, okay, we bother about them, but we will try to cope. We are more bothered about our food security, our lack of employment for our children, a lack of basic facilities the school, hospitals, roads, and other things. Otherwise, what happens in many places, the usual perception of threat, the governments, sometimes the respective governments, they play on this and try to pass draconian laws and other things basically to suit the political aspirations or the political requirements. So that's why it makes much more sense to understand the perception of the common people and ask them how they cope up with this threat, insecurity, and how they manage their lives. So this was the second part, where basically we try to combine the qualitative and a quantitative research in mapping the perception of common people about the threat and security in those regions, in Odisha as well as in Northeast. And the third distinctive feature of this research was basically to suggest a human security impact assessment tool. So what is this human security impact assessment tool? I think it's a process of identifying, predicting, evaluating, and mitigating adverse effect of any proposed development projects. In fact, we applied this for doing a case study of POSCO, which is the South Korean giant on the steel giant, which has been trying to set up like steel plant in Odisha for the last 10 years or so. They have not been able to do that. So the idea was, the whole thing was pushed without taking into considerations the implications for the people, which came very strongly like through this quick study which we did as a part of this overall study. So there, like, we try to cover a lot of domains while doing this impact assessment tool. Basically looking at people's perception, their knowledge of the economic benefits versus the socio-cultural damage. Many people, they do not know how much like they are going to benefit economically when a mega project is thrust upon them. What sort of socio-economic damage it would entail in the long run. Then the environmental implications, the possibility of like family and community disintegration, the social capital issues, food security, concerns about physical threats from the goons employed by the companies of such mega projects. Then to look at basically people's wisdom in mitigating disastrous effects of such projects. So how people basically plan to cope up with these changes if at all it occurs. Then to look at their own methods of resistance and prevention. So POSCO, like, we just got the backing of the government of India, backing of the state. Still then they have not been able to set up the plant for the last over 10 years. I'll finish, yeah. And over a period of time, due to this sort of like studies, due to articulation of the people's issues, I think a lot of changes are being incorporated. So right now, the amount of land the company was requiring, it has come down drastically. So number of like rehabilitation package for the people, it has been recast in a more people-friendly manner. So a lot of things have happened. So that's why it makes all the sense to do this sort of like assessment to bring to the fore the people's perception, how they perceive this sort of project. And this can be done like in a both longitudinal method and as well as a cross-sectional method. So you do over a like period of time, keeping like baseline as some sort of like reference so that you do the changes after a couple of years. The second is one needs to do it in a very cross-sectional manner. One can do comparatively like comparing basically the intervention communities and a non-intervention area, how the changes are taking place due to this sort of projects. So then a lot of like interesting facts, interesting perception of the people, those are going to be affected by this come to the fore, which warrant urgent attention by the policymakers and all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and now we will listen to the presentation of Ms. Sally Stairs from the London School of Economics, linking quantitative and qualitative studies, bottom-up research methodologies.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'm going to say something in general terms about linking quantitative and qualitative studies and about the particular role for bottom-up research methodologies in human security studies. I'll first of all say something about the terms quantitative and qualitative. I think these are useful heuristic terms or shortcut labels for broadly classifying types of research. Very crudely speaking, quantitative research involves numerical data, and qualitative research involves non-numerical data. That might be text, but it might be images, it might be moving images, still images, and so on and so forth. Typically, quantitative and qualitative approaches are suited to different kinds of research questions. So to give some examples, quantitative approaches are typically used for research questions that relate to distributions of phenomena, prevalence of phenomena, trends, associations and patterns, sometimes causes. So we might use for quantitative approaches data collection techniques such as representative or random sample surveys, administrative records, economic data, or experimental research designs. By contrast, qualitative approaches are typically used for questions about processes, about mechanisms, and about meanings. For qualitative approaches, we would typically use such techniques as, for example, in-depth interviews, focus groups, ethnographic approaches, and so on. However, so these are useful labels, I think, but we need to use them in moderation, not least because they are almost always symbiotic, and it almost goes without saying that you almost never have one without the other. There can be no quantification without qualification. We can have a very elaborate data set, but the meaning of the data set is ascribed by the labels that we attach to the names of the variables, the labels of the categories. So there's no counting without knowing what we're counting, and that comes from quality. There's almost always no quality without quantity. It's very rare to see a qualitative research report which doesn't allude to quantity in some way, even if that's just in terms of vague quantifiers. And by vague, I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but just to flag up words more, less, more prevalent. Sometimes this happens, this never happens. These are all ideas which are inherent in our understandings of the world. So, for example, in data collection in qualitative studies, it's often a good strategy to keep conducting interviews until we stop hearing new themes. This is a classic approach in qualitative research, and there's an implicit sense of counting in that approach, in the data collection approach. And in qualitative analysis and reporting results of interviews, it's natural to highlight which themes are mentioned by more respondents and which themes occur more rarely, for example. So the two things go always together, I think. The labels can also be unhelpful when they're used, as is sometimes done in academia, and I would like to know if this happens in the policy world as well. Sometimes these labels are used as synonyms for good and bad research, depending on your particular bias as a researcher. So in academia, certain disciplines, because certain disciplines tend to ask certain types of research questions, they tend to use certain types of research methodologies more often. They can then be very critical of methodologies that are used by other disciplines to answer different research questions. So often you hear people use the terms qualitative and quantitative used to apply to a methodology that doesn't really resonate with their worldview, with their academic outlook. But of course, all research should be judged in terms of, and I hesitate to say its quality, I'll say maybe its rigor or the standards instead, which are applied to its research design, methods of case selection, methods of data analysis, and methods of reporting. These are all crucial issues for all kinds of research, be they qualitative or quantitative. And the relative strengths of qualitative and quantitative research approaches can be employed side by side within a single study to increase the information that we can gain from any particular piece of research. So it can be very fruitful to combine, to link qualitative and quantitative studies. I give just a couple of examples here of typical or classic combinations of qualitative and quantitative approaches. These really depend, I think, largely on what your starting level or state of knowledge is for the research topic you're investigating. So to take the first one first, quantitative followed by qualitative, this will be classically used in a scenario where you already know quite a lot about the research field that you're investigating. The example here I've used as an empirical example is one of the topics for this research project. This is violence in the workplace. So say, for example, we know quite a lot about human security in employment, in the workplace. We could design and conduct a questionnaire and administer it across a sector or across a range of sectors to assess the prevalence of types of employment insecurity and their variability. And then we could take some respondents for follow-up in-depth interviews with employees, employers, other stakeholders, in order to gain more in-depth, context-specific, rich information about the particularities of employment insecurity. So we could start off with a broad quantitative approach and then drill down, get more in-depth information from a qualitative approach. Now, when we start a project not knowing too much about the field that we're investigating, typically a qualitative followed by a quantitative approach can be very fruitful. So in this scenario, say we know not much about employment insecurities, we might start off by conducting a set of in-depth interviews or focus groups in a vulnerable work sector to learn what are the key themes, what are the key concerns and experiences of this target group. This will tell us the main themes that we ought to be investigating in our broader survey. So we might use the information from those interviews to design a questionnaire, say, which we could then, from which we could then open out the scope of our research design. So we could administer the questionnaire across the sector or across several sectors for comparison. Okay, so the quantitative followed by qualitative, or qualitative followed by quantitative. And lastly, I just flag up, especially for research which is strongly led by advocacy, it can be extremely important to have, at the end of the process, a further qualitative layer of engagement, during which the findings of the research are presented to key stakeholders, to respondents, for validation, for feedback, and for dissemination and communication of ideas. I think this is particularly relevant for this research group. So what's the special nature of bottom-up research methodologies for human security? Well, I think the key is that they are fundamentally people-centered. So as the name implies, they start from ordinary people's perspectives rather than starting from experts' perspectives and just asking respondents to give information about those themes and concerns which are defined by experts from the outset. So answering a set of questions which have been pre-designed by experts. So in bottom-up research methodologies, we ask research participants to set the agenda, to define for them what is important to be studied. We tend to ask open-ended questions rather than closed-ended questions to open up the space of possibilities for the kinds of information that we can learn from these kinds of studies. Often the aim is to discover themes and issues and perspectives from respondents, as Vesna mentioned yesterday, almost to be surprised by the findings of our studies, to open up our eyes to phenomena which we might not otherwise have realized were important. And in a similar vein, in terms of contribution to the general state of knowledge, with bottom-up research methodologies usually lend themselves to theory-generating activities, to collecting together the themes and the issues which are important, and to formulating theories about how they're connected, rather than to testing theories. So we might start off with a bottom-up research approach to generate theories and maybe use a quantitative approach later on to test a theory. But of course, we never start from a completely blank page, even in bottom-up research methodologies, even if we try and make the space completely clear for respondents to suggest their own issues for discussion. Simply because, well, research topics are derived from the literature, they're derived from advocacy knowledge, they're derived from our own knowledge about the world. So we never really start from a completely blank page. So I think there are two senses of context specificity or context dependency, which are key to human security, as well as the empirical sense of context specificity, which is mentioned often, and that refers to the idiosyncrasies of people's life experiences, the diversity of different people's life experiences. I think there's also a context specificity and the sense of the researcher's context. So the academic or the advocacy or the policy contexts in which such research is situated, what you're reacting to and what you're trying to contribute to. And I think the process of linking different methodologies can be extremely useful, whether that's linking qualitative and quantitative approaches, or whether that's linking top-down and bottom-up approaches, I think linking methodologies is a really sharp tool for helping us to understand both types of context, both researcher context and research subject contexts. As such, I think it's a great tool for an ongoing critique and reflection on the concept of human security, as well as on the empirical reality of human security. So at the analytical or the conceptual level, we can ask when we compare and contrast and bring together different methodologies, what kinds of knowledge are produced with different techniques. And at the empirical or the substantive level, we can ask what kinds of facts do we discover from these different approaches. And the way we gain purchase on those questions is simply to ask these following questions. Where do the different methodologies connect and resonate? Where do they tell the same story? And where do these methodologies disconnect and raise further questions? Where do they tell different stories? And how can we make more sense of these disparate stories? So I'd like to briefly showcase a dialogic research methodology as a special case of a bottom-up research approach that explicitly addresses the dynamic between top-down and bottom-up research methodologies. It involves not just asking respondents or research subjects for their opinions, but engaging in conversation with them. So it really involves laying on the table the theoretical starting points of the researchers, and I think this is particularly apt for human security studies. So it has a top-down element that involves imparting the idea of human security to vulnerable audiences. It also has a bottom-up element that invites participants to talk about the themes of human security which are important to them. And it also involves a two-way exchange of ideas between participants and researchers in coming to a mutual understanding of what human security means in the participants' lives. And this is an active interaction between top-down and bottom-up elements. And I think it resonates very strongly with the human security approach because it addresses directly the normative aspect of human security, which is clearly articulated by researchers and around which discussion centres. It also addresses directly the agency and participation, which is central to the idea of human security. The participant takes an active role in deciding what's to be discussed in the course of the conversations. They're not just a subject from whom information is to be acquired. And it also addresses the agenda-changing motivation of human security. Hopefully, this then, again, to make reference to one of the comments which was raised yesterday about the distance sometimes between academics with their abstract ideas and the ordinary people who are living human security. Hopefully, the dialogic approach potentially reduces that gap between academic abstract ideas and ordinary people who are living human insecurity day by day. Ideally so that the research participants appropriate the idea of human security for themselves, and it potentially changes their lives and their perspectives. So I'd like to give a brief illustration of a dialogic methodology which was carried out by my colleagues here, Mary and Vesna and Denisa Kostovicheva. I hope they can therefore correct me if I'm wrong in any of the reports that I make about their research, and I would invite them also to participate in the Q&A afterwards, if they can contribute any more. Okay. So Mary and Vesna and Denisa carried out a study of human security in Kosovo recently using a dialogic approach. It involved several stages of dialogue. There are three main stages of dialogue. At the outset, there was a dialogue between the academic researchers, who started with the concept of human security, and local field researchers who would carry out the field research and the conversations with the informants. During that dialogue, the concept of human security was discussed between the academics and between the local researchers to arrive at an agreed definition of human security which made sense in local context. And from that, in fact, research instruments were designed, again, which would make sense in local context. A questionnaire was designed which was used as a guide for the interviews and so on and so forth. So first of all, between academic researchers and local researchers. There was a second stage of dialogue between local researchers and the citizens who were the subjects of the study. These were called the interlocutors and then the parlance of the researchers. So there was a dialogue between the local researchers and the informants across a range of regions and a range of ethnic backgrounds around the subject of human security, framed around these two very simple and practical questions. What or who makes you feel insecure? And what do you wish you could do but feel unable to do? And why is that? So the second stage was the dialogue between the local researchers and the informants. And there was a third stage of dialogue which related to the analysis and the findings and the interpretation of the study. So in that stage, the first round of analysis was undertaken by the local researchers who were closest to the ground. And then the second stage of analysis, there was dialogue between the academic researchers closer to the abstract theories and the local researchers who were closer to the empirical findings. And again, agreement was reached through discussion on the meaningful findings from that study. And to give you an idea of just a few of the empirical findings from that study, you can see how the findings from this study can be compared and contrasting with other results from other methodologies. So, for example, lots of the empirical findings resonated with information or knowledge that we already have from other sources, from other methodologies. There are a range of public opinion surveys carried out in Kosovo on a regular basis, for example, and Denisa and Mary and Vesna found in their study the similar story about the prevalence of themes of unemployment, economy and corruption as key concerns for informants and for local people in Kosovo. So some results resonated very strongly. Some elements of the research were able to elaborate on the interconnection between those themes, again, which is difficult to achieve through a classically quantitative approach to research methodology. So, for example, on the nature of the interconnection between worries about employment, worries about corruption, the fact that, for example, it is difficult to find work without having certain networks and certain connections. There were some results which were apparently questioning knowledge from other sources. For example, there was a slight difference in apparent levels of trust in police and local security forces found from this study than from what we know from other sources. It raises interesting questions about methodology and about the precise context specificity of this kind of topic of trust and confidence in certain institutions. And it will be fascinating, I think, to follow this up, asking, I think, as a first stage, what was the context of conversation in which this topic was broached and raised in the dialogic methodology, and also how is it framed and set up in other methodologies which were used and seemed to find slightly different stories. So raising interesting questions to follow up where there may well be other levels of intricacy and detail which would be very enlightening. And lastly, which is possibly one of the most exciting things from the studies, the discovery of themes which we didn't understand fully before, and a number of themes with multiple meanings, which again are not easily amenable to quantitative study, but which I think could be developed for other methodologies if that was deemed to be of interest. Denisa and her team called these multi-directional security markers, to highlight the idea that these themes were raised by respondents, but they weren't straightforwardly positive or negative in their connotations for people's human security and human insecurity. Just to give one example, self-reliance was a key theme that emerged, but self-reliance has positive and negative connotations. It's positive because it denotes empowerment in a state where there is a perhaps absence of provision of security. People are able to rely on their families, on their neighbours, on their close associates, and they derive a great sense of security from those networks of people. But of course it can denote negative connotations as well, because it denotes a withdrawal from the public sphere. It can indicate also an absence of expectation of state provision, and in the long term it implies perhaps a negative sequence of events. So I've put it up here, this is inherently unmeasurable. I'm not sure that I think these concepts are inherently unmeasurable, but what I think is key about them is that from this research is that their multifaceted nature is elucidated. It will be very difficult to get at this level of complexity and multiple meanings from a quantitative study. Not that we couldn't pick it up, but it would be difficult to be sure of what it meant without the rich description that surrounds a conversation. In social psychology, sometimes we call this cognitive polyphasia, and it's the idea that you might hold views which, from some perspectives, might be logically contradictory, but from your own perspective, in your own context, make a lot of sense, and especially when related to your different social identities. This is the kind of phenomenon, I think, which is picked up very nicely by this kind of study. So there's an example of bottom-up research methodology. I wanted to end with a very simple example of a modest, fairly simple technique for using quantitative analysis in a way that I think resonates more closely with the typical qualitative methodology approach than you usually see in the literature. Now, surveys are often criticized by qualitative researchers for being reductionist, simplistic, for taking concepts out of context and being too simplistic in that way. But here's a simple example that I have from a survey which was conducted as part of the European Values study in Kosovo. It's a little bit old. I show this example, I hold my hands up, not as an expert about Kosovo in particular, but this is meant to form just an example of the kinds of information that you can gain from this analysis. So just an example rather than a key empirical result to show you. Okay. So I'm going to show you an example of a multivariate analysis, which I think provides a way of depicting the interconnectedness of themes which are relevant to human security in a way which is typically approached with qualitative techniques, but I think can be appropriated with quantitative techniques. Okay. So in this study, people were asked how much confidence they had in a range of institutions. A list of institutions you'll see on the next slide. They were asked to respond on a scale of 1 to 4, where 1 means no confidence at all, and 4 means a great deal of confidence. So what you see next is a typical way of presenting these results. Absolutely standard, very fair, a nice summary of the results. On the vertical axis, the y-axis here, you see the average. This is just the simple mean level of confidence in each of those organizations. And the line connects the different mean scores, the average scores for the different organizations. NATO, the church, the EU, the UN, armed forces, police, and so on. I won't read out the whole list of organizations. I think what's striking from this graph is the similarity of levels of trust in different organizations. We almost might say, you know, there's no diversity at all. People seem to be very consistent in the opinions they have about different kinds of organizations. But there's a lot of variation underneath the surface. So to take one example, I can tell you that 28% of people say they have a high level of confidence in Parliament, and exactly the same percentage, 28% of people say they have high confidence in the justice system. But it's not the same 28% of people. If you do a simple cross-tabulation, you can see this, okay? So you start to ask, well, what are the patterns of associations between trust and confidence in these different kinds of organizations? Can we pick out any patterns? I've picked out some patterns. This shows you the results of a hierarchical cluster analysis. I can explain the details more in the break over lunch if anyone is interested. But I aim just to give you the conceptual idea of what the analysis can kind of show. So what you see here is a dendrogram or a tree diagram. On the left-hand side, you see each of the organizations listed separately. Each organization is sort of in a cluster of its own. And then the branches of the tree show you at which points the organizations are clustered together. You can see it's hierarchical because as one cluster is formed, it then might join another cluster until eventually just one cluster is formed at the end. Okay? So in the first stage, those organizations are clustered together which have the most similar profiles of supporters. Okay? So you can see that, in fact, I compared Parliament and the justice system before, which both had exactly the same level of high support. But I don't know if you can find Parliament here, just here. So you can see actually that Parliament has a much more similar profile of support with the police system than it just does with the justice system. The justice system, by its turn, the justice system has a more similar profile of support with the healthcare system than it does with Parliament. So you can see, and I invite people to give me ideas on whether these clusterings make sense. Another clustering which I think makes sense to the layperson, you can see at the bottom of the graph, those international organisations seem to receive similar profiles of support. Yeah. So I hope what you can derive from this kind of analysis is not just an idea about the correlations, the particular pairs of correlations between trust in different organisations, but you can see a larger picture about, from the group level, the whole group of respondents, about the patterns of trust and confidence in those different organisations. In the previous graph, each organisation is taken separately one by one. We have a lot of different snapshots, a snapshot for each organisation one by one. We juxtapose them informally. But what we have from the multivariate analysis is an idea of the group level representation of trust in all of those organisations and how they're all connected to each other. So hopefully this, I don't know if you're convinced, but I'd like to know if you are convinced that this kind of analysis brings us closer to the kinds of questions that we typically investigate with qualitative techniques. So just to make some concluding remarks, there are myriad ways that you can link qualitative and quantitative studies. Your choices in many cases depend on what kind of knowledge the researcher has at the outset and what kind of knowledge is desired from the research. Bottom-up approaches seem very closely aligned with the people-centered focus of human security. And I would like to argue that linking bottom-up and top-down approaches, or indeed linking any pairs or triads of different methodological approaches, can provide a key tool for critiquing human security concept and practice, both in terms of assessing the nature and the content of our current knowledge, and also addressing directly the normative aspects of human security. And I'd like to finish with a question to pose to the floor. What kinds of research questions, what kinds of evidence are more and less useful for your context and purposes? Are there biases or particular partialities in your fields? Which kinds of research are more and less credible? I think this is a key question which we need to address when we're planning our research strategies, bearing in mind our final audiences for our research. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists for their very comprehensive presentations. And now we have some limited time for questions and answers. Please, the floor is yours. Please.
I have a question to Subrat. In your human insecurity index, for Odisha, you have seven indicators, and more of these indicators is about that. Do you have real specific causality of these deaths to be this separation between number of deaths due to the dowry or number of deaths due to the natural calamities or number of people affected by malaise? Do you have a public statistic about this with real differentiation by the reason of the deaths? Okay. And you use only the public statistic, or you use also your evaluation, your own evaluation?
Maybe take several questions and then reply them all. More questions? Please.
Thank you. My question is also on the Indian study. First of all, thank you very much for sharing your results. I think it's really helpful. But my question is really, when you made a comparison, you created a binary between HDI and HII. And I wonder whether that's really helpful to create that kind of binary, because the purpose of HDI and what you are doing in terms of HII, you are looking at particular threats. HDI looks at something different. So it's not really either or. If you want to get a better picture, you really need to look at both of them. In fact, I would suggest that you should also look at peace index for your area, and you will get a different picture. So, I think in this kind of studies, it's not really, sort of like one is better, is kind of like new kid on the block, and we should use this now. I think we should avoid that. And the second issue is that you said the importance of people's perception and how important to get that. Ultimately, I think what Sally said and in her presentation, that's one of the fundamental issues with the quantitative studies and indexes. How do you get people's perceptions about human security in your index?
Thank you very much. Please.
Thank you, Wolfgang Benedek, my name. Thank you for these two very interesting presentations. I wanted first to ask on the Indian approach. You mentioned in the end that you were developing a human security assessment tool. And I was just wondering, we have a lot of experience with human rights impact assessments by now. So the question would be, what is so different with human security impact assessment, except that we exchange security for human rights? What kind of specificity do we need in order for such a tool to work? And then I would also have a question for Sally, who presented this bottom-up and dialogical methodology so well. Thinking of experience we have had in other such studies, I think it's extremely difficult if you go through a local researcher or somebody who puts the questions to another local person to say that he should convey a certain conception of human security, or even dialogue with that person, what is his or her conception of human security, and from that then derive certain comparable results. So maybe this is possible with a few people and with a lot of effort, but I wanted to know how you make sure that you get to comparable results, because we're having conferences on human security and we still go out from here with a different understanding. So how can you achieve a kind of common understanding among those who are answering the questions? Thank you.
Okay.
Sally, probably you get this question quite often about how local. When you talk about local researchers, especially with this study particularly, how do you establish, what qualifies being a local researcher? And I think it's quite a significant point, especially in relation to the previous question. Thank you.
Thank you. Please.
I wanted to thank you very much for the two presentations. I think they were both very interesting. And I have, more or less comments and questions, and I would like to complement what the colleague said about all-time comparisons between HDI and Human Security Index, and my question is as well why it is constantly being compared, whereas we also heard, I think, during one of yesterday's presentations that Human Security Index is used basically to measure incidences at country level, whereas HDI is used for something completely different. Not that I want to sound like Monty Python. The second one is basically a question maybe for Sally, and use the opportunity now. For instance, in Serbia, in 2010, we did conduct a prevalence study that was done precisely by seconds on prevalence on violence against women. And our main concern is at a certain point we want to repeat the same survey. What is the best time frame when to repeat it in order to be able to measure possible changes? And I think this question is also relevant maybe for some other elements that are related to different aspects of human security as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, or we have to refer back to the panelists? Please, Mr. Singhdeo.
First, regarding this availability of the data, as I mentioned in my presentation, we basically were guided by the availability of reliable data from reliable secondary sources, and that too availability of data over a long period of time. In fact, that these two considerations also we are guided by that while selecting the indicators. And all these areas we mentioned, we have got data which are available in the public domain over a period of time. Because, for example, malaria death, I am sure the number of deaths would be much more than the number reported by the government, because the number of deaths reported by the government, only we wanted to begin somewhere. Many cases go unreported mainly in the tribal areas and other areas. But at the same time, we wanted to begin somewhere on the basis of the data which are available on the public domain and which are collected in a very scientific manner by the government agencies and officials. And the second, SDI versus HII. I am very sorry if I gave the impression to comparison. I thought I just wanted to mention it is different, because when we developed all these indicators and other things, a lot of questions came on. Already we have got a SDI. Why you want to develop a HII? So the idea is to say that it's different. We are not basically comparing between SDI and HII. So that's why I just thought I'll just mention that. And regarding the perception of the common people, which the study we have done in those areas, it was easier for us because we worked there. In all those conflict pockets, we have been there for quite some time. In fact, we have been working in all those districts with over 40,000 tribal households. And a lot of the findings are factored into our subsequent intervention in those areas. So that we used a lot of the local NGO boys and girls who accompanied, who did the research along with us. In fact, in many places we also happened to meet the armed cadres also. And so that's a different thing. I probed this question with many of them, that why we have joined this movement. Are we being guided by the Maoist ideology and all? That's what nothing doing. We do not know anything about that. We don't have anything to do in our village, and we get roughly 80-90 euros per month as some sort of salary, then they become trigger happy. So a lot of other things are there. So the idea is that when you are locally, certainly it will become difficult for an agency which doesn't have presence there. Since we have been working there for quite some time, then it became easier for us to enter those areas and directly talk to the people. How do they feel about this, the ongoing the violence, burns, strikes, killing, and other things. In fact, that study has been given here, where we have met common people, all common people randomly picked up in all those difficulty, severely affected areas. A school teacher, a local woman, the agriculture laborer, a small shop, like that. Basically, how do they know and what is their perception of threat and how they cope up, basically to know their coping mechanism. How on a day-to-day basis they manage to live with these insecurities. So that's quite interesting, so which is a part of this study. And regarding the impact assessment, I think like in a sense it's different because we try to at least combine in this tool all the three elements of fear, want, and dignity, which you don't find in many cases. Like it is different from environmental analysis. Before a like mega project is done, usually environmental analysis or feasibility study is being commissioned. But here through this study which we have done in this book, we have given a study which we did in the area where POSCO, the South Korean company, is planning to set up a steel plant. So we have tried to combine the questions in such a manner that it addresses all the three elements of like freedom from fear, freedom from want, and life to dignity, which you may not necessarily find in a usual like impact assessment study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Sally?
Thank you. I try to answer these in reverse order. Firstly, on the question on the time frame for repetition of a study. My answer is it depends, but I have more useful things to say than it depends, hopefully. I think, well, to give an example, if I understand correctly, the British Crime Survey is run on a rolling basis, so it has monthly updates of statistics. To give another example, the British census is conducted every 10 years. So to give two extreme examples, and of course one of the key determinants of the timeframes of those studies is the resources that are required, of course. You've already factored in the resources, so that's not news for you. But I think in terms of substantive importance, I think I would upplay the usefulness of more repetitions than of increasing time frame, because of to address as well as you can questions of reliability of results. Because you know, when you're looking at a trend like a time series, if you have a little blip in a time series, you want more points either side to see whether that was, you know, a trend that would lead to a trajectory in one direction, or whether it was just an unusual circumstance. So if there are contextual factors which you can involve in your decision, I think that would be key, and especially in the case of a sensitive subject where people's willingness to report these phenomena might have been affected, say, by media salience of certain topics. I think if you could bring those in, that will be really helpful. And apart from that, I think my advice or my idea would be to look to the literature on other topics and to follow what was done in other topics. So if you have, for example, data on trends of reporting of other types of violence or insecurities, and you have information on over what time periods there seem to be changes, you could factor that in. Similarly, if you have information on trends of the same kind of information but in different contexts in different countries. So I think I would try and get advice and experience from other related literatures, and maybe make an informed decision based on that, but taking into account contextual factors. On the question of what qualifies a local researcher as a local, so both of the questions about the dialogic methods, I refer to my colleagues who carried out the dialogical method. But just from the point of view of a boring methodologist, I have a few comments. In terms of the localness of the researchers, I think that the key thing is that you're trying to maximize the rapport between the interviewer and the interviewee. And especially for subjects such as human security, they're very delicate, very sensitive subjects, and we know that people's responses are strongly affected by the context in which they are asked the questions. So I think the localness would be questions of, depending on the context, ethnicity, age, gender of the local researchers. And then on the first question on the comparability of the local researchers' uses of the concepts, yes, it's a big problem, but it's a problem for all social research, and even at the other end of the spectrum with a survey where you might think, well, I've written the same word in my questionnaire and administered it to 100 different people, it now means the same thing. We have loads of entertaining examples from survey methodology research where this has clearly not happened. So I think the questions about, again, it's an empirical question about the comparability of understanding of the concepts before the researchers carrying out the interviews and also for the research subjects who are responding to the questions. The only other comment I'd like to make is that I think I would hope that you could mitigate a little bit against these worries in the context of this kind of qualitative dialogical research more than you can in the case of survey research, where people have ticked a box. You essentially don't know what was going through their head when they answer the question. So usually you conduct a lot of pre-testing, piloting, cognitive interviewing to find out the range of understandings that people brought to the questions. But essentially your data set only contains the information about the tick boxes. Whereas with the kinds of interview transcripts, the field notes from the researchers in the dialogic method, you have all of the context that surrounded the question. So I would hope that where people had very different understandings of the concept of human security, this would actually be clear from the totality of the data, the qualitative data that you've collected. But as I say, I would be very grateful if Vesna and Mary had extra comments to add.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and stimulating session. Thank you very much for your questions and your attention. The session is closed.
In the afternoon we will be...
Sorry.